Fitness Q50 presents The Hidden Cost of Chronic Inflammation in Athletes. Chapter 1, The Performance Problem No One Sees. Performance begins to change, subtly, not in output at first, but in recovery. Sessions feel heavier, weights move slower, endurance fades earlier than expected, not dramatically, but consistently. You start to notice something. The same training produces less adaptation, the same effort produces less return. This is the first signal. Most ignore it. They assume it is age. They assume it is time. They assume decline is inevitable. It is not. What you are experiencing is not simply aging. It is a shift in the internal environment, a change in the body's baseline state, specifically a rise in chronic inflammation, not the kind you feel after a hard session, not acute soreness, and not localized damage. This is different, systemic, persistent, low grade. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly and over time. It begins to interfere with performance systems. Recovery slows, adaptation weakens, fatigue lingers longer than it should. This is where most athletes make a critical error. They increase intensity, they add volume, they push harder, trying to force adaptation. But the system is already constrained. The signal is no longer the problem. The response is inflammation alters the recovery environment. It changes how the body interprets training stress. It shifts the balance between breakdown and repair toward breakdown. This is why progress stalls, even when discipline remains high, even when training is consistent, even when effort is maximal, because performance is not driven by effort alone. It is driven by adaptation capacity, and chronic inflammation reduces that capacity. This is the hidden cost, not visible, but measurable, not immediate, but cumulative. And if left unmanaged, it becomes the primary limiter, not strength, not endurance, not skill, but recovery itself. This is where the conversation changes, from training harder to recovering intelligently. Because the athlete who controls inflammation controls adaptation, and the athlete who controls adaptation extends performance. Chapter 2, What Chronic Inflammation Actually Is. Inflammation is not the problem. It is a necessary signal, a response to stress, a trigger for repair. After training, it is essential. Muscle damage occurs, the immune system responds, inflammatory signals increase, repair begins, adaptation follows. This is how performance improves. But this process has a requirement, resolution. Inflammation must turn off. The system must return to baseline. Only then can adaptation complete. Chronic inflammation is different. It does not resolve. It remains active at a low level, continuously. This is the distinction. Acute inflammation is cyclical. Chronic inflammation is constant. It becomes the background state. The body is always responding, even without a clear threat. This creates a problem. The system never fully recovers. It never resets. Signals overlap. Training stress, life stress, environmental stress, all layered together. The immune system remains engaged. Cytokines stay elevated. IL-6 increases. TNF-alpha persists. These are not just markers. They are active signals. They influence physiology directly. They interfere with muscle repair. They disrupt metabolic efficiency. They alter hormonal balance all at once. This is why it is dangerous. Not because it is extreme, but because it is constant. You do not feel it clearly. There is no sharp pain, no obvious injury, only a gradual shift. Energy becomes less stable, recovery becomes less complete, performance becomes less predictable. This is the hallmark. Chronic inflammation does not break the system. It degrades it, slowly, relentlessly. And most athletes continue training through it, unaware, because the signal is subtle, but the impact is cumulative. Every session adds load. Without full resolution, every day compounds the baseline until the system is saturated. This is when performance stalls, not from lack of effort, but from lack of recovery clearance. The body is no longer adapting. It is surviving the stress. This is the shift. And once it happens, progress requires a different strategy. Chapter 3, The Biological Mechanisms. Chronic inflammation is not passive. It is an active physiological state driven by signaling molecules. Cytokines. These signals regulate the immune response, but they also affect performance systems directly. IL-6 increases under stress. TNF-alpha follows. Both remain elevated in chronic inflammation, not high enough to alarm, but high enough to interfere. This is the problem. These signals alter muscle protein synthesis. The anabolic response weakens, repair slows, growth becomes limited. Even with proper training, even with adequate protein, the signal is disrupted. At the cellular level, mitochondria are affected next. Energy production becomes less efficient. ATP output declines. Fat oxidation decreases. Endurance suffers, not from effort, from reduced capacity. This is where fatigue changes. it arrives earlier and lingers longer. Inflammation also alters insulin signaling. Glucose uptake becomes less efficient. Fuel delivery is impaired. Performance becomes inconsistent, unpredictable. Hormonal systems are not immune. Testosterone production declines. Cortisol remains elevated. The environment shifts from anabolic to catabolic. This is a critical transition because adaptation requires an anabolic signal. Without it, training becomes breakdown. Without sufficient repair, this is why athletes plateau, not from lack of stimulus, but from disrupted signaling. Every system is connected: immune, metabolic, and hormonal, all influenced by inflammation. Simultaneously, this is not one pathway failing, it is systemic interference, quiet but powerful. And over time, it compounds. Small disruptions accumulate until performance noticeably declines. This is the biological cost, not visible externally, but decisive internally. And unless addressed, it overrides training quality completely. Chapter 4: The Recovery Constraint. Recovery is not passive, it is an active physiological process driven by signaling, energy availability, and system coordination. Chronic inflammation disrupts all three at once. The recovery window extends. What should resolve in hours now takes days. Muscle damage lingers. Repair is incomplete. The next session arrives before the system resets. This is where accumulation begins. Fatigue stacks, tissue stress compounds, adaptation slows. Not because training is wrong, because recovery is constrained. Inflammation interferes with tissue repair. Satellite cell activation declines. Collagen remodeling slows. Tendons remain stressed. Joints feel less stable. This is where injury risk increases, quietly, without warning. The nervous system is affected next. Autonomic balance shifts. Sympathetic dominance increases. The body stays activated, even at rest. Parasympathetic recovery is reduced. Heart rate variability declines. This is measurable, but often ignored. Sleep becomes compromised, not always in duration, but in quality. Deep sleep decreases. Recovery hormones are disrupted. Growth hormone release declines. Cortisol remains elevated at night. The system never fully powers down. This creates a feedback loop. Poor recovery increases inflammation. Inflammation further reduces recovery. Cycle repeats. Performance suffers even if training remains consistent. And this is the constraint. Not effort, not discipline, recovery capacity, and once constrained. Every additional stressor compounds the problem. Training, work, life all feed the same system without resolution. This is why high-performing athletes plateau. They are no longer limited by training. They are limited by recovery bandwidth. This is the shift from adding stimulus to protecting recovery, because adaptation only occurs when recovery is sufficient, and inflammation reduces that threshold significantly. Control recovery, or performance will decline. Chapter 5: Performance Consequences Over Time. The decline is not immediate, it develops gradually across weeks, then months, then years. At first, you adjust, you compensate, you push harder, but the pattern continues. Strength stops increasing, loads feel heavier at the same weight. Progress stalls, not completely, but noticeably. Endurance follows. Pace becomes harder to sustain. Heart rate rises faster. Recovery between efforts slows. You feel it, but cannot explain it. This is the signature. Output declines, despite consistent training, despite maintained discipline. This is not deconditioning. It is impaired adaptation. Inflammation reduces mitochondrial efficiency. Energy production drops. Fuel utilization becomes less precise. Fat oxidation declines, glycogen dependence increases, fatigue accelerates. This shifts endurance capacity downward. Then comes structural impact. Tendons begin to signal stress, not injury, but irritation, persistent tightness, localized discomfort, reduced elasticity. This is not random. Collagen turnover is impaired, repair is incomplete. Each session adds load without full restoration. This is how injury develops, slowly, then suddenly. The plateau becomes permanent. Strength remains flat. Endurance does not improve. Body composition resists change, even with precision, even with effort. This is where frustration increases, because behavior has not changed, but results have. This is the hidden divergence. Input remains high, output declines. The system is no longer responding, and it is absorbing stress without adaptation. This is the critical threshold, where athletes either adjust strategy or accelerate decline, because chronic inflammation does not stabilize, it compounds. Every unresolved cycle adds load, until performance degradation becomes visible, not as failure, but as limitation. This is the long-term cost, not dramatic, but decisive. And unless corrected, it becomes the new baseline: lower, slower, less resilient. Chapter 6: The Inflammation Sources Most Athletes Miss. Most athletes look in the wrong place. They blame training, they blame volume, they blame intensity, sometimes correctly, but not completely. because inflammation is not only training induced, it is systemic, multi source, constantly influenced. The first source is obvious training itself. High intensity increases inflammatory signaling. Heavy volume extends it. Without proper recovery, it accumulates. But this is only one layer. Diet is the second source, often underestimated. Ultra processed foods increase inflammatory load. Refined carbohydrates disrupt metabolic control. Omega 6 intake dominates. Omega 3 intake is insufficient. This creates imbalance. At the cellular level, inflammatory pathways remain active, even at rest. Alcohol compounds the effect, even moderate intake. Recovery is delayed. Sleep quality declines. Inflammation persists longer than expected. The third source is environmental, rarely considered. Toxin exposure, air quality, chemical load, these create low-level immune activation. Chronic, subtle, but real. The fourth source is psychological stress, often ignored by athletes, but highly influential. Work pressure increases cortisol. Chronic stress sustains it. The body interprets this as threat. Inflammatory signaling increases, even without physical load. This is critical because stress and training use the same system. They do not separate, they compound. The fifth source is sleep disruption, not just duration, quality. Fragmented sleep increases inflammatory markers, reduces recovery hormones, prevents resolution. Night after night, this builds baseline inflammation quietly. The final source is cumulative load, training, nutrition, stress, environment, sleep, all layered together. This is the true driver, not one factor, but total system load. This is why many athletes plateau. They optimize one variable and ignore the others. But the body does not isolate inputs, it integrates them continuously. This is the key insight. Inflammation is not a single cause problem, it is a systems problem. And systems require coordinated control, not isolated fixes. Until this is understood, athletes will continue chasing symptoms instead of removing the source, and performance will remain constrained. Chapter 7, the aging factor after 45. The baseline changes with age, not dramatically, but measurably. Inflammation increases, even without added stress. This is known as inflammaging, a persistent low-grade inflammatory state built into the system. Over time, the immune response becomes less efficient. Activation increases. Resolution decreases. The signal stays elevated longer than it should. This alters recovery dynamics. After 45, the same training creates more inflammation and takes longer to resolve. This is the shift, not weakness, not lack of discipline. Biological change. Antioxidant capacity declines. The body becomes less effective at neutralizing oxidative stress. Free radicals accumulate. Cellular damage increases. Mitochondria become less efficient. Energy output declines. Recovery requires more input for the same result. Hormonal support also changes. Testosterone gradually decreases. Growth hormone output declines. Both are critical for repair and adaptation. Without them, inflammation has greater impact. The system becomes more sensitive to stress. Even moderate load can create disproportionate fatigue. This is why older athletes feel different, not weaker, but less resilient. The margin for error narrows. Recovery must be precise. Training must be intentional because the buffer is smaller. What was once tolerated now accumulates faster. This is where many athletes fail to adjust. They maintain the same approach, same volume, same intensity, same recovery habits, but the system has changed and the cost increases. This is why inflammation becomes dominant after 45. It is no longer a secondary factor. It is primary. It dictates recovery speed. It dictates adaptation quality. It dictates long-term performance trajectory. This is the critical realization. Aging does not remove performance. It changes the rules. And the athletes who adapt continue progressing, while others plateau, then decline, not because they stopped training, because they stopped adapting. Chapter 8, Research Evidence and Data Signals. This is not theoretical. It is measurable across multiple systems. And inflammation leaves markers in blood, in recovery data, in performance output. The most common marker is CRP, C-reactive protein, a general indicator of systemic inflammation. Elevated CRP correlates with reduced recovery and lower performance output, even in trained individuals. IL-6 is more specific. It rises with both training and chronic inflammation. When persistently elevated, it signals incomplete recovery cycles. TNF-alpha follows a similar pattern, linked to muscle breakdown and impaired repair. These are not abstract values. They reflect real physiological conditions inside the system. Metabolic markers also shift. Fasting glucose increases, insulin sensitivity declines, fuel utilization becomes less efficient, energy delivery is compromised. This directly impacts endurance and repeat effort capacity. Now consider VO2 max, a key performance metric. Studies show a decline with elevated inflammatory markers, not just from age, but from systemic load. Even well-trained athletes show reduced oxygen utilization when inflammation remains elevated. This is critical because VO2 max reflects system capacity, not just effort. Strength output is affected as well. Reduced protein synthesis rates led to slower adaptation. Plateaus occur earlier and last longer. This is why progress stalls. Despite consistent training, recovery data reinforces this pattern. Heart rate variability declines when inflammation is elevated. Resting heart rate increases. Sleep quality decreases. These are early signals, often missed because they appear subtle. But trends matter. Over time, the pattern becomes clear. Higher inflammation, lower adaptation, lower performance output. This is the relationship. Consistent, predictable, and measurable. This is why elite athletes track data, not for curiosity, for control, because what gets measured can be adjusted, and inflammation must be managed with the same precision as training itself. Otherwise, the data will show the outcome before performance fully declines. Chapter 9, the performance protocol, training adjustments. Training must change, not in intent, in structure. The goal remains performance, but the constraint is recovery. Inflammation sets the limit. This is the new variable. Volume is the first lever. Too much volume extends inflammatory signaling, delays recovery, reduces adaptation. This is where most athletes fail. They add more work instead of refining it. Effective training is not maximum volume. It is optimal stimulus, delivered precisely, then recovered completely. Intensity must also be controlled. High intensity drives adaptation, but it also drives inflammation. Used strategically, it is powerful. Used excessively, so it becomes limiting. This is where structure matters, and not random effort. Planned exposure. Zone 2 becomes essential, not optional. It supports mitochondrial efficiency, improves metabolic control, and reduces systemic stress. This is the foundation for sustainable performance. High-intensity work sits on top, layered carefully and not stacked repeatedly. This is the difference between progression and accumulation. Deloads are not weakness. They are required. A planned reduction in load allows inflammation to resolve, restores system balance, prepares the next adaptation cycle. Without deloads, the system never resets. Plateau becomes inevitable. Training frequency must align with recovery capacity, not ambition. More sessions do not equal more progress. Only recovered sessions do. This is the principle. Every session must justify its cost. In recovery demand, if the system cannot absorb it, it should not be applied. This is precision training, not maximal training, because after 45, performance is engineered through control, not volumes. Control the stimulus, control the recovery, and adaptation returns. Chapter 10, the performance protocol, nutrition and lifestyle. Recovery is not driven by training alone. It is supported or limited by daily inputs. Nutrition is the primary lever, not for calories, for signaling. Food influences inflammation directly at the cellular level. The first variable is quality. Whole foods reduce inflammatory load. Processed foods increase it. Simple, but often ignored. Refined carbohydrates create instability. Glucose rises quickly, then drops. Inflammatory signaling increases. Repeated daily, this becomes baseline. Protein is critical, not just for muscle, for repair signaling. Insufficient intake reduces recovery efficiency, even with proper training. Fat intake must be balanced. Omega-6 is typically excessive. Omega-3 is insufficient. This ratio matters. It influences inflammatory pathways directly. Correcting this reduces baseline inflammation. Over time, alcohol disrupts the system, even in moderate amounts. Sleep quality declines, recovery hormones decrease, inflammation persists longer. The cost is higher than perceived. Micronutrients play a role. Magnesium supports recovery processes. Vitamin D influences immune regulation. Deficiency increases inflammatory activity. These are not optional, they are foundational. Now consider sleep, the most powerful recovery tool, not negotiable. Deep sleep drives repair. Growth hormone release peaks. Inflammation resolves. When sleep is compromised, recovery is incomplete. Night after night, this compounds quickly. Stress management is equally critical. Psychological stress increases cortisol. Sustained elevation maintains inflammation, even without physical training. This is often overlooked, but highly influential, because the body does not separate stress types, it integrates them continuously. Lifestyle determines baseline state. Training builds on that state. If the baseline is inflamed, training cannot overcome it. This is the hierarchy. Lifestyle first, training second, because recovery begins before the session starts and ends only when the system returns to baseline. Control inputs, reduce inflammatory load, and the system becomes responsive again. Chapter 11, the advanced recovery stack. Baseline control is not enough, not at this level. Advanced performance requires precision, measured intervention, targeted recovery strategies. The goal is simple: accelerate resolution, reduce inflammatory load, restore system balance faster. Cold exposure is one tool. It reduces inflammatory signaling, constrains excessive immune response. Used post-training, it can accelerate recovery, but timing matters. Too early, it may blunt adaptation. This is precision, not routine. Heat exposure works differently. Sauna increases circulation, enhances cellular repair processes, supports cardiovascular function. Repeated use improves recovery capacity, and over time, contrast therapy combines both: cold and heat, alternating exposure, driving circulation, improving recovery efficiency. This is not comfort, it is stimulus control. Supplementation can support the system. Omega-3 reduces inflammatory signaling. Curcumin modulates cytokine activity. Magnesium supports nervous system recovery. These are not shortcuts, they are amplifiers of a controlled system. Blood testing introduces clarity. CRP levels indicate baseline inflammation. Fasting glucose reflects metabolic control. Hormone panels show recovery environment. This is data, not guesswork. Wearables extend this further. Heart rate variability tracks recovery state. Resting heart rate shows systemic load. Sleep data reveals repair quality. Trends matter, not single readings. Patterns define strategy. This is the difference between reactive training and engineered performance, because advanced athletes do not rely on feel alone. They validate with data, then adjust continuously. The recovery stack is not excessive. It is necessary at higher levels of performance because margins are small and errors accumulate faster than expected. This is where longevity is built, and not just through training, but through recovery mastery. Control the recovery process, and performance becomes sustainable. Chapter 12, Strategic Takeaway, Control the Signal. Inflammation is not optional, it is inevitable. Every training session creates it. Every stressor contributes. The question is not whether it exists, it is whether it resolves. This is the defining variable between progression and stagnation. Most athletes focus on effort, more weight, more volume, more intensity, but effort is not the limiter. Signal control is. Training sends the signal. Recovery determines the response. Inflammation sits between them. If it resolves, adaptation occurs, strength increases, endurance improves, performance expands. If it persists, adaptation is blocked, fatigue accumulates, progress stalls. This is the mechanism. Simple, but often ignored. After 45, this becomes critical because the system changes. Recovery capacity narrows, inflammatory load increases, the margin for error disappears. This is where discipline evolves, not just in training, but in control. Control of inputs, control of stress, control of recovery. This is how elite longevity athletes operate. They do not guess, they measure, they adjust, they refine continuously. Because performance is engineered, not assumed. The athlete who manages inflammation maintains adaptation. The athlete who maintains adaptation extends performance. For decades, this is the difference between temporary fitness and sustained capability, not talent, not genetics. Control the signal, and the system responds.